Good evening and welcome to the Real Science Exchange, the podcast where leading scientists meet over a few drinks and casual conversation, discuss the latest ideas and trends in animal nutrition. Hello, I'm Scott Sorrell, your host for tonight's conversation. Tonight we're going to jump right into it because we have a lot to cover. My co-host for tonight is Dr. Clay Zimmerman. If you've joined us on other podcasts, you've already met Clay. But if this is your first time listening in, Clay, why don't you share a little bit of something about yourself? And since this is a virtual pub, tell us what you're drinking tonight.
Sure. So one thing I'll share is that my wife Karen and I were the parents of 5 young adults. But I think that one of our guests today will put me to shame in that category. And Scott, what I'm drinking tonight is in honor of the season and a company that's actually near our headquarters in New York. I'm drinking some hard cider this evening.
That is one of your favorites. I was wondering when you were going to get around to that, Clay.
Yes,
Thank you.
yes.
Very well. All right. Thanks, Clay. Tonight, we'll continue the conversation we started with Dr. Adam Locke during his webinar titled Supplemental Fatty Acids, More Than Just Fat and Energy. Dr. Locke, your presentation generated a great deal of interest. We had over 1,000 people register for your live webinar, and over 550 people have already watched the recorded version on our YouTube channel. So thank you for joining us here again tonight at the Real Science Exchange.
Thank you, Scott. It's exciting to hear that it's generated that much interest, and I look forward to continuing the discussions.
You're very welcome. And becoming quite a familiar face here at the Real Science Exchange. You've appeared on the Real Science Lecture Series, and this is your second trip to the Exchange. And since you know the drill, tell us a little bit about yourself, but more importantly, tell us something that maybe not everybody in the industry knows about you. And then more importantly, tell us what you're drinking tonight.
Okay, yeah, no, I really appreciate being back. The last one of these we did in the pub as a follow-up to the Discover conference. That was a lot of fun, so looking forward to this one. As many of you can probably tell straight from the accent, not here from Michigan, from a dairy farm in the southwest of England. My parents used to milk about 120 dairy cows, Holsteins, and they still live on the farm now. We haven't milked now for about 20 years. I often tell people my dad is one of the only few people I know that still sleeps in the bedroom he was born in. So it's always ironic when I've moved 3 states in a different country when a few years ago he started trying to give me moving advice. So so we're fortunate that I've always born and raised on the dairy farm, and that's really where my passion is. Something that people don't really know, my wife has a PhD in nutrition as well, in swine nutrition. We met at graduate school, and I have 2 boys here, aged 12 and 9 in 3rd grade and 7th grade. They're doing virtual school here now. So that leads it nicely onto what I'm drinking. Today I have a gin and tonic, a Hendrick's from Scotland, from Ayrshire, not far from where my sister-in-law and brother-in-law live. It's the Hendrick's factory. So I have a very traditional gin and tonic here. So thank you.
I'll kind of get to what I'm drinking here tonight. But one thing, Adam, you may not know about me, I have more than a passing interest in the fat industry. I've spent a significant part of my career in the bypass fat industry. In fact, I was the very first what they call business manager for a product called Megalac, which I'm sure you're aware of. And so I've got a soft spot in my heart for a gentleman by the name of Dr. Don Palmquist. Don, along with Tom Jenkins, invented the technology that became Megalac. And we've since become friends. And the last time that I was together, I had a Balvenie 12-year-old Scotch with Dr. Palmquist. And so tonight I'm lifting my glass in honor of Dr. Palmquist.
Oh, so, good. Yeah, I mean, both of those guys are, pioneers in this area, and it's been a lot of fun. Dr. Jenkins in particular has been a very big mentor of mine ever since I moved over here to work with Dr. Bauman. Dr. Jenkins being a big mentor and a good friend of mine. So I appreciate all the work that they've done. And actually, I had an hour call with oleic in England this morning, who are the first people that did Megalac. So it's a small world here, right?
Yeah, a very small world. Absolutely. Absolutely. Adam, would you mind introducing your guest and tell us a little bit about him and your relationship? How did you come to invite him to join you here at the Exchange tonight?
Yeah, well, thank you. I'm really pleasure to bring Stacy Nichols from Vita Plus along here tonight for our discussions. I've known Stacy probably, I was trying to think back about this, when I was at Cornell as a postdoc with Dr. Bauman back in the early 2000s would have been the first time I'd met Stacy, and we've always had good discussions. And it was really when I moved here to Michigan that I think we really got to know each other well. You have a good friendship, good collaborations. So Stacy's a technical manager for Vita Plus here in the Midwest here. And Stacy has helped mentor, I'd say, nearly all of my graduate students here, either officially or unofficially. He's always been a great source of advice for my graduate students, a great sounding board for me, and we bounced a lot of ideas back and forth with each other. It's helped with diets and trying to keep me relevant sometimes when I try and get a little bit too crazy with stuff. Tries to hopefully keeps me grounded in the industry, which I think is vitally important. And another big thing I have to give a shout out to Stacy and to Vita Plus for is that they've helped support three of my master's students here now through Vita Plus fellowship that they've run here and over in Wisconsin. And been very fortunate that we've been able to do this partnership. And I think it's been able to help advance the science and also help with the training future people in the industry. And so Stacy's been a big part of that. So I'm glad Stacy could join us here tonight.
No, we thank you for bringing him along. And last we talked the other day, and Stacy, you shared something that I found quite interesting, and that's how you've taken a bike riding recently. Tell us a little bit about that.
I started cycling in April. I was trying to get in better shape and ended up with a foot injury in April, and I couldn't do the intensive walking I was doing. So I started cycling and picked up the old Raleigh 10 speed I bought when I was 15 and put some money into it and ended up at the end of the summer doing a 75-mile bike ride on it. And then first week of September, I bought a well-used Trek. And for the year, I'm closing in on really close. I'm really close to 1,500 miles now cycling for the year. So my average bike ride is between 20 and 30 miles. And I try to go 3 to 4 days a week. So.
Well, that's awesome. That's a lot more than I've ever ridden in my entire lifetime, and that's been a while. But I want to circle back to something Clay said earlier, something about the number of children perhaps that you might have sired. Do you want to comment on that?
My wife and I have 8 children. Our oldest will be, well, she's 29. Our youngest will be 10 next week. So we have 19 years between them. We have 7 girls and 1 boy. And the boy is not the last one. He's number 6. So he has 2 younger sisters.
Why don't we jump right into it, guys? Adam, as we mentioned before, your presentation was very interesting to an awful lot of folks. And so can you walk us through what maybe 2 or the 3 macro themes were that you presented during the webinar?
Yeah, sure. I think the 30,000 foot level is how a friend of mine, Ian Sawyer, summarized a half-day session I did in Australia a few years ago, talking about all this different work, and kind of summarized it up and saying, well, you're telling me that a bag of fat's not a bag of fat. And I'm like, well, I guess I could, that kind of summarized up my entire half-day talk in that one sentence there. And, and I think that's true, as you talked about different fat products that are out there now, Scott, we used to just think of fat as a source of energy, and fat was fat wherever you got it from. And I think we're really starting to get a better understand much how we now move from crude protein to talking about individual amino acids and balancing for amino acids. That's really where we're going with fats and fatty acids now. So we're going to be talking about what are the fatty acids in a fat supplement, not just what's the price of the fat. We have to compare these different things on a like-for-like basis. That's the sort of the big picture there. We've really I think, made some advances, us and others, trying to understand the role of different fatty acids, different blends of fatty acids. And also now we're also challenging the concept of don't feed fat to fresh cows. That has been so I think overall we're challenging dogma that's been out there from some of the days that you talked about earlier, because we're in a different world now with maybe like talking about different fatty acids at different levels in the diet. We're certainly talking about different types of cows as well. So challenging some of the dogmas there. So looking at specific fatty acids and blends of fatty acids, when to feed them, and which cows respond best to different fatty acids. That's kind of the big picture there.
So Adam, you talked about, you made the analogy between going from crude protein to amino acids and going from fat to fatty acids. So do you envision how far down the road will we be balancing our diets for individual fatty acid levels as opposed to crude fat?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure we're necessarily there yet. I think some nutritionists could be, and Stacy could talk more about this in a minute. I think that the simplest place where we can do some of this at the moment is through the choice of what type of supplemental fats or fat blends that we're feeding. When we think about basal diets, corn silage, alfalfa, they're going to change to some extent, but they're not that dissimilar, especially in a heavy corn silage based diet. Where I think we can have the biggest effect on the overall fatty acid profile of a diet is in what type of fatty acids we're feeding in supplemental fat, when we're in very enriched, fat sources, is like ruminant inert fat supplements, and also in maybe some of the oil seeds that we're feeding, cottonseed, for example, or if you're distillers versus cottonseed. Another, very topical one now is, conventional soybean products versus high oleic soybean products as well. They're the places where we can have the biggest impact there. So right now, I know there's a lot of people that are doing it more from the choices that they're making on the fatty acid supplement side, on blending different fatty acids, and from how we can do that in models. I think that's the best place we can do that right now, as opposed to the macro bigger part of the diet so much. What do you have any thoughts on that, Stacy?
In the last week, we've just introduced to our team a option in their ration balancer where they can go in and actually look at the level of supplemental fatty acids that they're including and the amounts of C16, C18, C18-1 and oleic acid in order to more align with what Adam's talking about through the results in the research. So it's pretty exciting. I mean, I feel like we're moving on the research pretty quickly and trying to stay ahead of what's going on in the industry just by allowing our team to better supplement fatty acids to cows without having to think a whole lot about it. They've got the ability to lock those numbers in and optimize to them and meet the recommendations that Adam's making in the research.
So Adam, you've done some really exciting work looking at different fatty acid supplementation regimens throughout lactation. Can you summarize some of your findings there as far as what you're seeing?
Sure. So in the vast majority of commercial fat supplements that are out there now, the major fatty acids in them would be palmitic acid, C16-0, saturated fatty acid, stearic acid, 18-0, another saturated fatty acid, and then oleic acid, 18-1. Okay, they're the major fatty acids you're going to find in calcium salt to palm oil, saturated mixed prills, and then the palmitic acid enriched prills. So they're the major fatty acids in those. There are some specific unique fatty acid supplements out there that may have some more polyunsaturates, omega-6, omega-3, but not the vast majority of them, and certainly not used in the amounts that you would those other ones that we talked about. So we've spent a lot of time looking at palmitic, stearic, and oleic acid. Our original emphasis was on palmitic and stearic being saturated fatty acids. And where we and others saw with palmitic acid was its ability to promote milk fat synthesis. That was very consistent across all stages of lactation, where as we increase palmitic acid, and we have some good data on this, as you As the cow eats more palmitic acid, as the cow absorbs more palmitic acid, it's a pretty linear increase in milk fat yield. Okay. We've also done a lot of work on digestibility, and this is Clay probably remembers more some of my talks back when I was a postdoc at Cornell. This is honestly an area where, this is quite a topical thing right now. What I said 10 years ago or 15 years ago, based on the data we have now, is quite different what I say now. But we make these incremental steps, right? So my thoughts on fatty acid digestibility now are very different to what they were 15 years ago or 10 years ago. As we've learned more and done a lot more work on that. So what we've observed is that under typical situations now, if we feed more stearic acid in a fatty acid supplement, we see big drop-offs in digestibility, to the point sometimes if you're feeding a stearic enriched product, a cow may not actually absorb any more energy than she would in the control diet without the supplemental fat, because digestibility is so poor. So we're doing a lot of work now to look at how can we improve fatty acid digestibility, because stearic acid is always a major fatty acid that a cow sees because of biohydrogenation. So in these higher and higher producing cows with higher intakes, what can we do to improve digestibility? And that brings us to oleic acid, that third fatty acid that's in most products. We have good data showing that if we feed more oleic acid, typically we can improve fatty acid digestibility. That ties in with some nice work from the 60s and 70s looking at oleic acid as an emulsifier. And then the other really exciting piece now is that when we've looked at different ratios of palmitic and oleic acid, they're the two major fatty acids I would focus on right now. At the moment, I don't really see a need of feeding stearic in a fat supplement because of the roles palmitic and oleic can have. What we really see now is that cows at different levels of milk production respond differently to different blends of palmitic and oleic acid. That in, mid and late lactation cows, I'd really be looking at a higher palmitic acid product. But then if I'm in very high producing cows in peak lactation, I'd probably be looking at a more balanced blend of palmitic and oleic, and that then led us more onto some of the fresh cow work that we can talk about as well. But that's kind of where we are now. My focus within those three fatty acids would be palmitic and oleic, and depending on what type of herd a nutritionist has, what type of grouping situations they have, we would maybe look at different blends of those two fatty acids. There's the major fatty acid in supplemental fats, and I know a number of people in the industry have tried to sort of take on some of those different approaches, which maybe Stacy can talk to more.
So
Yeah, I guess I can. I've always been a maximum production guy, right? And it's always been, maybe to the chagrin of some of my clients, but it's always been interesting to try to figure out how do we make the high producing cow more efficient and has our nutrition lined up with her genetic potential. It's if we have the ability for her to get more energy out of the diet just by changing the fatty acid strategy, that can be huge for our dairy producers and their bottom line. That's why I still think that and maybe we'll get there. I do believe that you've got to go back and do another titration study with very high producing cows and what is the right level of these blends of fat supplements to at that 60-30 ratio. Is 1.5% of supplemental fatty acid enough, or should we be 2? Should we be 3? Mm-hmm. Getting more fat into those high producing cows that are intake challenged, and that could be one of the key things that's holding them back, could really lean and create more energy corrected milk, more pounds of milk fat for our dairy producers. So
and you see straight away here, Scott and Clay, this is kind of this academia industry relationship here where we can challenge each other on both sides of this, I think. And that's even like doing these sort of talks as well and getting feedback. You get the ideas or the challenges and the pushback from some of these sort of areas. And Stacy's right. I mean, we've focused in on 1.5% supplemental fatty acids for the last 3 or 4 years based on a study we did in 2013, where now I think we do need to go back and revisit that. And now that we know more about digestibility, as Stacey's alluding to, maybe we can and we need to push higher when we got 50, 60 kilo cows, 120, 140 pound cows, that we could probably push more to.
Just to follow up real quick question. Sorry, Clay. You were saying fatty acids. Does it have to be in the form of fatty acids, or can it be in the form of triglycerides?
Oh, that's a good question. And a good academic answer to that is always, well, it depends. So if you're talking about saturated fatty acids, palmitic, stearic, and you're talking about those sort of prills that we often would think about, I would always take the free acid product over a triglyceride. If you look at some of the classic data that came out of Ohio State with Jeff Firkins, Maurice Eastridge, and others back in the 80s and 90s, where they looked at hydrogenated tallow and hydrogenated palm oil, the digestibility on some of those supplements was frankly terrible, right? We've done a study more recently where we compared a palmitic acid enriched free acid versus a triglyceride. The triglyceride still had poorer digestibility, but it was nowhere near the drop that we saw with those hydrogenated products. And again, the big difference there, I think, is stearic acid versus palmitic acid. So in my mind, if you're talking about a palmitic acid enriched product right now, there'd have to be a marked cost benefit to that triglyceride for me to consider feeding a higher level of it to get the same amount of performance. So in general, I'd always get the free acid product. Now, calcium salts by their nature are always free acids, they're the free acid bound to the calcium. If you're talking about cottonseed, soy-based products, they're going to be in a triglyceride there, but that's kind of a different beast then. But with those saturated products, I'd always take the free acid if I could.
So Adam, when you're supplementing oleic acid, how much of that is leaving the rumen as oleic acid versus stearic?
Yeah, so that's another good question. I would say probably not a huge amount more than what's leaving if you just put the oil in the rumen. So let me explain that a bit more. So most of the whenever we're in any of our studies where we're looking at these palmitic oleic blends, as Stacy was alluding to, most of that oleic acid is coming from calcium salts of palm fatty acids. Okay, so most of that oleic acid is in that calcium salt. There's a misperception that term rumen protection really means that all of that fatty acid is protected from the rumen. Actually, Don Palmquist meant that term rumen inert, rumen protected as the other way around, where the calcium salt protected the bugs from the fatty acid. And people have that's got flipped over the last few years. Now, there's some slower release of that. So I think there is typically some slightly less biohydrogenation of that oleic acid in a salt than if I just threw the palm oil in the rumen. Certainly you have less of a negative effect, I think, on feed intake, risk of milk fat depression. But still a proportion of that's going to be biohydrogenated. If I look at some of Tom Jenkins' work, I think it was Jenkins and Bridges back in the day, when they looked at some of those rates, and we need to revisit that, I'd be looking at anywhere from 40 to 70% of the oleic in a salt is biohydrogenated. All right. So if you fed an extra 100 grams of oleic acid in a salt per day, you might be getting anywhere from 20 to 60 grams of that reaching the small intestine. And we know from some of our abomasal infusion work that those lower levels of oleic reaching the small intestine can still have some biological effects. And again, we're thinking a lot of this now, a lot more than just energy, right? So, that oleic that was biohydrogenated still leaving the rumen as stearic, some of it. So it still has potential for energy, assuming it's absorbed. But we're thinking a lot more of these bioactive effects of these fatty acids. And I think anywhere from that 20 to 60 grams of oleic can have some benefits on fatty acid digestibility, certainly. And we're starting to think some benefits on energy, nutrient differences on nutrient partitioning. And the one we're really excited about, which maybe we'll talk more in a while, is on adipose metabolism in transition cows as well.
So if you're feeding, you had mentioned earlier feeding, high oleic acid soybeans, for instance. Is the same thing true there? Is most of that being hydrogenated in the rumen?
Yes, I'd say it would be. Yeah, if you're feeding roasted soybeans or a high oleic bean, the level of biohydrogenation there would be pretty extensive, 70, 80%. But remember, biohydrogenation is never 100% complete. So if you feed more, you're going to get some more reaching the small intestine. You'd probably have to be more careful at some of those higher levels of those feedings, with making sure you don't, milk fat depression risk. But I get asked a lot about high oleic beans more and more now. But what I would always say is pound for pound, a high oleic bean, it was going to be a lot safer feeding than a high linoleic bean. Okay, and Stacy has a lot more experience on this than I do with the high oleic beans.
Yeah, what have you seen, Stacy?
We have 3 herds that I know of that are either growing and roasting high oleic beans on farm and then processing them and using them, or they're buying them from a neighbor and roasting them and processing and using them. Diet inclusion rates of 10 to 17, 18% of dry matter, pretty high feeding rates, and we've seen no negative impact on milk fat percent. If anything, we've seen some pretty big improvements in energy corrected milk yield. The one herd in particular, 7, 8, 10 pounds more energy corrected milk yield. But feeding 8 to 10 pounds per head per day of high oleic soybeans.
Wow.
What's total fat in those diets, Stacy?
Fatty acids supplementations closing in, or total fatty acids is closing in on 6.5, 7%.
So that's an interesting.
And is that about the limit you go to?
Do I?
Is that the limit you'll go to typically?
The dairy producer wants us to go higher because he's looking at decreasing purchase feed costs and the improvement that he's seen in production on his cows. Now, the concern we have, and we need to do a better job at it, is what happens in late lactation cows. Are we causing cows to get overly obese because of that extra oleic acid? But we have not seen a negative impact on milk fat that we would typically expect when we're feeding a high level of oleic. So on milk fat percent, I mean, that herd right now is running low to mid 80s on milk production with a 4.3 milk fat. So it's pretty exciting, right? And they're all Holsteins. They're all black and white cows.
And that's the maybe we're getting slightly off topic here, but that's the thing, as Stacy says about where his dietary fat levels are, is for a long time now we feared fat levels in diets for a milk fat depression risk, right? But if you get that diet set up correct, that rumen can handle those levels of fatty acids. It depends often on what the fatty acids are, right? Linoleic. But if he's feeding that same level of a conventional bean, I'm not sure he'd be doing quite so well. And I think the oleic's having some effects, and not having the linoleic is having some effects as well. But the other key component there is that you have to have everything else right set in that rumen from the diet. So you got enough effective fiber, and you have the if you get that working well, you can feed higher levels of fat and maintain really good milk fats, right? And drive more milk fat.
I've gone back and used that RICO study a lot, Adam, to show dairy producers why we should be feeding higher fat levels in their diets. Yeah. Because if we can avoid biohydrogenation, the more fat we put into the diet, the more milk fat she's going to produce. Whether that's coming from cottonseed, whether that's coming from high oleic soybeans, whether that's coming from fatty acid supplementation, the more fat we get into her diet, the more milk fat yield she's going to have. And economically, until the last few months, milk fat was a really bright story in the industry for the last 5-6 years. So
I think that's a very good point.
Stacy, kind of a follow-up question before you were talking about that you were looking to maybe decrease the fat a little bit in those late lactation cows. Is there any, and maybe Adam can chime on this as well, but do you look at altering the fatty acid composition of the fat in the diet dependent on stage of lactation, whether that's pre-fresh, fresh cows, high producers, mid lactation, like the late lactation, does the fatty acid profile of the fat that you feed change?
Well,
Or
yeah,
do you change it?
the research would say it does, and the way we're trying to target it is transition cows. Just your first 2 to 3 weeks in the fresh period, being that higher oleic supplementation, and then and then we have to ask the it depends questions, right? Because what's a high group on a dairy farm? Is it everybody that's not a fresh cow, or is it a true high group? And we see on a lot of these dairies, today, where the high group is a true high group. They're making 110, 115, 130 pounds of milk. And the research would tell us we want the higher oleic in those diets. Once we move into the later lactation, typically we're seeing the supplementation levels come down from where we've been where we're seeing in the research. We're not supplementing 1.5%. We're supplementing more like 1%, but we're moving toward higher palm in those diets, still keeping some oleic in from trying to take advantage of the improvement in fatty acid digestibility, but we're really tailing that off in those later lactation cows. The challenge becomes for a dairy nutritionist is they really need to understand what the definition of a high group on a dairy farm is if they're going to push a lot of oleic acid at cows, because you don't want to get cows obese at the end of lactation. And yes, energy corrected milk, fat corrected milk will be, based on the research, would be the same if no matter what the level of oleic acid we're putting in, but dairy nutritionists are still judged by producers on percent milk fat. So, and oleic can have an impact on the percent. So got to be careful there too, and understand what the groups that we're targeting are.
Where some of that work has come from, give Stacy a lot of credit here. Maureen Weston works with Stacy at Vita Plus now, and she did some of this work with her masters, just looking across wide ranges of milk production and doing different blends. And we heard Stacy talk about the 60-30 blend, 60% palmitic, 30 oleic, where very high producing cows post peak do perform better on that versus a sort of 80% palmitic acid. But then as soon as you get below maybe 90 pounds of milk, 95 pounds of milk, they do better on that higher palmitic. Certainly in post-peak cows, when we feed them more oleic, we will see greater rates of body weight gain. So as Stacey said, you need to sort of be careful with that as we move through, and that's where I think grouping strategies really come into play here. But then that's what led us then to sort of look at using some of those higher oleic blends in those fresh cows, which is really paying off and really showing great interest now.
So, Adam, metabolically, why do those cows perform differently as they go from higher production to lower production, related to fatty acid profile?
That's a good question, and we have a few ideas on that. And what we're starting to understand with oleic acid, often when we think about bioactive fatty acids in human nutrition, animal nutrition, you often hear about omega-6, omega-3 fatty acids, right? Everyone's heard of omega-3 fatty acids. We're starting to understand more now that oleic acid, which is an omega-9 fatty acid, oleic acid can have as many or some of the sort of biological effects that these omega-6, omega-3 have in different ways. So as a key bioactive in terms of switching genes on or impacting different metabolic pathways, oleic acid can have some real potent biological effects. So what we've seen is that oleic acid can have direct impacts on adipose tissue, especially in some of our work with fresh cows. Can actually increase rates of lipogenesis, decrease rates of lipolysis, which is great in a fresh cow, right? And it looks like oleic acid can have some impact on insulin sensitivity of adipose tissue. Again, something that can be potentially very important there. And so that also points to why we may see higher rates of body weight gain in cows fed oleic acid. There is data in rodent models and in non-bovine models, showing that oleic acid may actually have some direct effects on insulin secretion from the pancreas. Typically, when we feed high oleic acid blends, we see a higher circulating insulin levels as well, which again ties in with the body weight story, right? Lower NEFA levels that we see in fresh cows. On the palmitic acid side, as I said earlier on, we know palmitic acid stimulates more milk fat production. The mammary gland typically starts triglyceride synthesis. Milk fat's basically triglycerides, right? 95, 98% triglycerides. The more palmitic acid is available to the mammary gland, the more triglycerides she's producing, so the more milk fat we get, as long as we have the other fatty acids that come to that part. So Joe McFadden has a very interesting story around palmitic acid, around the ceramide story, and Joe was on the other pub meeting that we had as a follow-up to the Discover conference, and he has a very interesting talk at the Discover conference, and some of that's around his ceramide story, and he's taken data from some of our work and in some of his own studies at West Virginia, showing that when you feed more palmitic, you get some more ceramide synthesis that can maybe have some insulin sensitizing effects and may help post-peak cows maintain more nutrients going to the mammary gland still. So there's a number of lines of evidence here that kind of fit into some of those type of things. So
you mentioned before, Adam, that you've changed your mind about fatty acid feeding over the last 10 years. As you look forward, what's it look like in the next 10 years from an academic perspective? And then I'm going to come back and ask the same as Stacy. What does he see happening from a practical perspective?
That's good. I think to answer that fully, I'm just going to mention a bit about some of the fresh cow work that we've been doing, that Stacy alluded to, where the old concept was don't feed supplemental fat to fresh cows because they were already mobilizing a lot of body fat. So why feed more fat when there's already so many fatty acids in circulation? And I've never really liked that idea, because fatty acids that get absorbed from the diet in the small intestine are kind of very, very much in a different pool than if fatty acids are being mobilized. We did some of our early work with palmitic acid enriched supplements with fresh cows from calving, first 3 weeks of lactation. Saw great performance, like 4.5 kilos more energy corrected milk, but they did lose more body weight, which, about 25 kilos more body weight, which is consistent across a number of studies, which I think is manageable, but if you're aware of it, but it's maybe not ideal. So that's where that, along with some of our work with oleic acid that we've talked about around body weight gain, in adipose metabolism, we then started coming back with some of these higher oleic acids. So this is kind of where we, 60% palmitic, 30% oleic. And we have a couple of good studies now showing that we can get as good levels of milk production, another 4-5 kilos more energy corrected milk in a fresh cow with these palmitic oleic blends without losing additional body weight. And we've seen that in the fresh, and then we saw that had a really great carryover effect. And we just had a study this last summer at ADSA where if we carried on with that blend in that peak period, so from week 3 to week 10 of lactation, we got another incremental increase again in milk production. And that kind of ties in with that very high group of cows that Stacy was talking about. So I'm very interested in that palmitic and oleic in the fresh cow going forward. Also interested in oleic acid maybe in the close-up diet as well. So really interested in that oleic acid story, particularly related to adipose tissue metabolism. Andreas Contreras, a good friend and colleague of mine here in our vet school here, expert on adipose metabolism. We're starting to do a lot of work in that area together. I think that's going to be a real important area going forward, better understanding these sort of major fatty acids in the diet, particularly palmitic and oleic. Another big thing in the future is we need to find ways to improve fatty acid digestibility. Stacy mentioned earlier, if we feed more oleic acid, we should be able to improve digestibility. But I think there's more that we can do in that area. There's, classic data, more fatty acids a cow consumes, lower total fatty acid digestibility. A lot of that's driven by drop-offs with stearic acid. So maybe there's limitations in emulsification capacity in the small intestine. And we're doing some work on that, and I think we need to do more work on that in the future And I think if we can help improve overall fatty acid absorption going forward, that's a big way. We can improve nutrient efficiency, and milk production. A big take home from that recent ADSA Discover conference around the transition cow is animal health, immune status, health in general. Big picture, role of oleic acid in the immune system, I think, is important. But I think omega-3s is going to be a big thing, longer term as well. There's a lot of interest around reproduction right now. But if we look at some of the human data, I think omega-6, omega-3 fatty acids and the immune function is going to be a big one in the future. Challenge with ruminants is how do we get them past the rumen because of biohydrogenation. I'm particularly interested longer term now in omega-3s, and particularly the EPA, DHA, they're sort of the fish oil omega-3s. They're the ones that I think have the real potent biological effect. So, longer term, I think they're big areas of that. So, they're big things going forward. Obviously, let's not forget the big take home for any dairy is how do we maximize and promote yields of milk fat and yields of milk protein. They're the two things that drive milk check, right? Of course, we have to have all these other things that come with it. So we're often thinking and have a student with Vita Plus right now that's really focusing on how can we maybe do a better job at promoting milk protein yield around with fatty acid supplementation. How does amino acid and fatty acid supplementation tie together here? How do we balance energy and amino acids, or nutrients and amino acids here? So I think that's still a big part of this going forward, because ultimately, yield of fat, yield of protein is what we need to focus on throughout that whole lactation as well.
So Adam, back to the oleic acid story for a minute. And
Okay.
When you're supplementing these earlier lactation cows and you're minimizing body weight loss, is that having any positive impacts on reproduction?
I would assume so. We've not measured that in any of our studies. Our research herd at MSU isn't really geared up for any of that, and we have a number of researchers, very active dairy nutritionists here, that we're not able typically to keep those cows going through the whole lactation. But if we are improving milk production without increasing body weight loss, one would assume that we're having some benefit. We're certainly not having a negative effect there, right? A key in some of these things is getting these cows back into positive energy balance, in terms of priority of nutrient use, lactation versus reproductive system. So I think anything we can do to minimize excessive body weight loss, all mammals to some extent mobilize body reserves in early lactation, right? The cow's not unique in that, and it's certainly not an extreme example of that. And it's all about balance. If we can balance that up, maintain a healthy cow, that I don't think we're certainly having any negative effects there. Often, sort of bigger picture here, often we're still we're still focused on like a 365 calving cycle, and as we get higher and higher producing cows, maybe that isn't what we're focused on, especially if you're not in a grazing situation, right? So
great.
Stacy, how about you? What do you see from what's going to change over the next 10 years from a practical perspective in feeding fats to dairy cattle?
Yeah, so the first question you asked was, well, where have you come from, right? So 10 years ago, I was pretty anti-fat just because of the whole biohydrogenation story, and supplemental fats are expensive. With the change in milk fat pricing the last 5 to 6 years, my story has really changed on that. Where do we go from there? I really think that the emulsifier thing is huge. Can we do something? Is it going to be all about oleic, or is something going to happen with the emulsifier side of things where we can improve fatty acid digestibility, continue to allow our dairy producers and their cows to be more efficient with the feed we're giving them? The other thing, I guess I was sitting here jotting down some notes when Adam was talking, is there protection technologies that would allow us to take specific fatty acids, use them like a nutraceutical, deliver them to the small intestine and target a specific stage of lactation to benefit immunity, to benefit somatic cell count, to benefit reproductive performance, and do it in a better way than we're doing it today, where it's either a saturate that's all prills or a unsaturate with some level of protection. Is there the ability to do a better job with protection technology to deliver specific fatty acids downstream? And I guess, the omega-3s, the omega-6s is a big one. Definitely, you see some companies that are promoting milk with DHA in them, and they're adding algal oil to get that done. Can we make the cow do that if we can protect that fat and move it downstream? And then the other one that's big, which is, Adam, you might have to correct me here, which is where Dale Bauman started his whole interest in this, is what about CLA? And is there a way that we can do a better job protecting CLA and improve CLA concentration of milk without all the negative effects that adding CLA to a ruminant diet has today? But I guess from my point, it would be adding more value to the product coming from the cow, right? Is it CLA that's a very good anti-carcinogen? Is it an omega that's going to improve brain health and overall immunity? Is it some other nutraceutical that we could deliver through the milk fat in the milk? And I just think that's fascinating where we could go as a dairy industry if we're able to do that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of exciting things you're saying there. I totally agree on bioactive nutraceuticals in the feeds, even more so maybe for the cow herself, but also for manipulated milk. I think there's a lot of opportunities for niche products. High omega-3 milk, high CLA milk. The CLA story kind of died off. There's huge amount of exciting data from rodent models, in vitro models with CLA, cis-9-trans-11 CLA in particular, phosphoric acid, the precursor of it, coming from biohydrogenation, and enriched milks and their impact in rodent models. Where that became really hard was translating that to human data, to human results, because simply put, when you're looking at something that has disease prevention and health maintenance, it's very hard to show long-term human benefits of something like that versus something that could cure a disease, where you can go in and treat something. So the human data kind of didn't back up the rodent model there, just because of how hard it was, to follow people, those nurses' health studies, the framing studies type that, to follow people for 50 years and try and look at milk intake and milk fat intake and then try and show that. So we talk about our 10-year, 20-year history. I was quite actively involved in a lot at that area. Where I see milk, and particularly milk fat, going forward now is let's promote the health benefits of milk fat in general. And CLA is a fantastic component of milk fat. And challenge the dogma around saturated fat. And, but butter is making an inroads back again now, right? And so I think like some of those areas as well. But I certainly agree there are some opportunities for some of these niche products there. But where I don't like it is if someone starts to say, well, my milk's better than your milk. Let's talk about milk and milk fat as a healthy component of the diet in general. But 100% agree, there's a lot of opportunity for these bioactive and nutraceuticals, maybe transferring it to milk, but also I think for the cow herself. I think that's a really exciting area. And fatty acids are, offer a lot of opportunities from some of that. And also fatty acids can maybe also offer opportunities as a delivery mechanism for some of those nutraceuticals as well.
This is pretty fascinating. You got me to thinking here. So what about transfer to the calf through colostrum?
Yeah, it could be through colostrum or it could be in utero.
Yep.
right? So, the whole, programming type deal. And there's a lot of interesting data in some of those areas now. I've not actively done any of those studies ourselves, but as we start to maybe do some more dry cow work, maybe around oleic acid or other fatty acids, what impacts does that have on the calf herself? Now, it might not be through colostrum either. It could be through a milk replacer as well, right?
Right.
And Mike Vanderhaar just published some recent studies from here at Michigan State recently where they were looking at giving a single dose of fish oil in the first colostrum a calf received as an additive, and looking at potentially some of the health benefits going forward. So I think there's a lot of opportunities there. But this whole, in utero transfer of health status of calves, or long-term effects on calves, programming, Barker hypothesis would be the kind of the classic term people would use for that. I think that's a real fascinating area in the future. If I remember, I think Jeff Dole's had some data out of Florida around heat stress. Mm-hmm. If I recall, and calves that were born during times of heat stress versus not in heat stress, what was their subsequent milk production when they hit the dairy herd? So across species, there's a lot of data on fetal programming work, which I think is really exciting. And there's that data about that key fresh period of a dairy cow. And we have some data with fatty acid feeding. If you feed fatty acids the first 3 weeks of our palmitic oleic blends, that first 3 weeks, and then you stop feeding them after 3 weeks, another 7 weeks later, we still saw about a 4 kilo benefit on milk production. So there's programming of the cow herself, maybe is it the mammary gland or other tissues in that early period. Barry Bradford has work, where he gave specific anti-inflammatories, if I recall, once or twice straight after calving, having some long-term lactation benefits. So I think that whole programming piece play is going to be a big area going forward. Not just in dairy nutrition either, but human health, human nutrition as well.
Right.
So, Dr. Zimmerman, if you don't have any additional questions, perhaps we'll move into some audience questions. Just a couple here, real quick. Angelo's asking, what about polyunsaturated fatty acids and NDF digestibility?
I can have a stab at that first of all. So the classic dogma has been when you feed fat, you drop fiber digestibility, right? That's sort of coming from work in the 80s and 90s. Lou Armentano had a good meta-analysis on that a few years ago that kind of challenged that. Under sort of fairly normal levels of feeding of like typical commercial fats, you don't see those drop-offs. And the big exciting one for us has been whenever we feed a palmitic enriched supplement, and 60, 70, 80% palmitic acid, we consistently see improvements in NDF digestibility. Probably 3, even 4 percentage units improvements in NDF digestibility. And, in some of our studies, that helps drive those energy corrected milk production improvements we see. It's not all just on milk fat, right? If we improve NDF digestibility. Polyunsaturated fatty acids probably have more likely to have a negative effect on NDF digestibility. If you look at some of the classic work on biohydrogenation and what I just simply call toxicity of fatty acids, linoleic acid, for example, different bacterial species are more or less sensitive to that in an in vitro system. And the more sensitive fatty acid, the more sensitive bacteria to linoleic acid are often those that do fiber digestion, so the Butyrfibrio species. So often if you feed available linoleic acid in the rumen, you probably are getting some shifts in bacterial populations, which would result in less fiber digestibility. So, that's where you have to be careful maybe with those more polyunsaturated fatty acids, or feeding higher levels of rumen available unsaturated fats. Honestly, a good example is you can feed more linoleic acid from cottonseed than you can from distiller's grains before you see negative effects, right? And that comes down to how available those fatty acids are in the rumen, how quickly the bacteria have to biohydrogenate them. And I think that's a good example. The other example was our discussion we had earlier with conventional soybeans versus high oleic beans. Oleic acid is, I think, if you simply think it has less unsaturated double bonds in, it's less toxic to rumen bacteria.
All right, Stacy, Michael would like to know how quickly do you see a response in milk fat after starting to feed palmitic acid?
I would say you're going to see a measurable response within 4 to 5 days. I don't know that anybody's paying that close of attention to their dairy herds to try that, but I'm pretty confident we're going to pick it up pretty quickly. You're not changing if you're feeding a high palm, like an 80-10 ratio, you're not doing a lot to the diet to change rumen fermentation, right? So you just come on top of your current diet with a high palm product. You should see the milk fat response in 4 to 5 days. When will it fully get there? I don't know how long it takes to fully to see the full response, and I don't necessarily know that that any of the research would point us to that. But I mean, it definitely seeing the responses in week 1 or 2 in the transition cow work. So I think you're going to see the milk fat yield response pretty quickly.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
So this might be a little bit out of your wheelhouse, gentlemen, but we've talked a lot about palmitic acid. Palmitic acid, for the most part, that goes into dairy diets comes from palm oil, correct? And in Europe, a lot of Europeans are not using palm oil for sustainability reasons. And so I guess my question would be, what do you see as perhaps another alternative source for palmitic acid if it's not palm oil?
Yeah, that's a question I often get asked. And I visited Malaysia once and saw some of these palm operations. There are other vegetable oils that are, richer sources of palmitic acid. Nearly all vegetable oils contain 20-40% palmitic acid. So these palmitic enriched products are out there now are only 80%, 90% palmitic acid because of some degree of fractionation, right? In palm oil, most of the unsaturates go into food or cosmetics, and the palmitic acid is left over for other purposes. So there are certainly other vegetable oils available that can be rich sources of palmitic acid. The sustainability questions around palm oil production are often, to some extent, similar discussions and questions we have around sustainability of the dairy industry, right? So that's an interesting discussion, and there are a lot of efforts. There are a number of different palm oil sustainability certification programs, and some of that clearly, deforestation has been an issue, I think, in the past. Managing that. One thing I would say that really impressed me when I've started to learn more about the palm industry is that when you have a adult palm tree growing, they're cropping that palm tree 3 or 4 times a year, and that same tree is growing, is giving fruit for 20, 30 years, I believe. So it's not like, some of the other oils where, you're turning that land over every single year. So, they're similar to the dairy industry. There's some of the concerns with sustainability of the dairy industry and the palm industry. Are they all fair accusations that are thrown at our industries? I think the same as we're making great strides and great efforts. I know the palm industry is in terms of genetic selection of long viable palm trees. Different uses. How can we get more from the same land without having to take more land? It's the same questions that we have for the dairy industry as well. But clearly, it's a concern, right? And there's a lot of emotional tugs with that, as the same as it is with the dairy industry as well, right? But I think it can be a very sustainable industry, similar to the dairy industry as well.
So, Adam, as we wrap it up here, can you give us a couple items that you can share with the audience that they can take home tomorrow and begin using with their dairies?
Yes, I think number one is next time someone's trying to sell you a new fat product, and there seems to be something different coming out every day, right? Remember, bag of fat's not a bag of fat. Number one question is, what's the fatty acid profile of it? Hands down, fatty acid profile of any supplemental fat is going to be the first and the most important thing that's going to determine what type of response you're going to have to it. Right now, if I was advising my dad, what to feed if we were still milking cows, I'd be looking at different blends of palmitic and oleic acid in my fatty acid blend part of my diet. Okay, and that's really what we're talking about here. So in that fresh and very high cow, I'd be looking at 60-30 kind of ratio of palmitic and oleic acid. You can get that from single products that are out there now, or you can do it with blends of commercial products. And then as we progress, I'd be looking at a higher palmitic acid to get more milk fat yield, maybe minimize body weight. That's kind of where we are right now. As Stacy said, I think I'd also be looking at where can I push maybe some of my other efforts in terms of fatty acids in the diet. Remember, fatty acids aren't just coming from these ruminant nut fats. The higher oleic beans really interest me. Cottonseed really interests me as well. And then how do we balance the whole diet around that? But for me, bag of fat's not a bag of fat. Fatty acid profile. When you work out what your nutritional strategy is for your client or on your particular farm, what type of grouping strategy you have, what abilities you have to have different diets on the farm, that then opens up to what type of program you're going to have. And then that's when you talk to people like Stacy, who are, I think, on the cutting edge here in the industry on how best to implement what you can do on your own farm.
Yeah, great advice. Stacy, what kinds of words of wisdom would you impart to your colleagues in the industry?
You're going to have conversations with your dairy producers and understand their abilities to add fat on farm. I would suggest everybody gets some level of calcium salts into their rations to provide oleic acid just from the improvement in fatty acid digestibility. Start looking at the blends, especially in those fresh cows and those high producing cows. And then you've got to get creative, because what's the feeding rate of the mix you're taking to the farm? How much fat can you put in the mix? Is the producer willing to handle multiple bags on farm? There are some ratio products out there that are on the market and getting really close to the blend, to the levels that Adam's talking about in the blends. You're going to pay a premium if you use a single source product. So blending, taking a palm product, taking a calcium salt, blending them together to meet the ratios that have been shown to be effective in research is going to be more cost effective than going out and buying one of the blends on the market. But going and buying one or two of the blends on the market and using them decreases chances for error by the feeder, decreases the confusion and how to get it done. And when we talk a fatty acid ratio of 60-30, that's not 60% of one bag and 30% of the other. It's what's the fatty acid profile of those two feeds and what's the ratio of those feedstuffs that the producer has to add. And you have to understand all of that to make it effective. Having conversations with producers to understand their on-farm capabilities, and starting from there. We've got several farms where we put a small amount of palm or a small amount of calcium salts in the mix going to the farm, and then they're just adding one bag of fat on the farm. And as our dairies have gotten bigger and they're buying more ingredients on the farm, feeding rates of mixes have gotten lower, and mixing fat into a mineral premix or a protein mineral mix, you're limited just on how much you can add. So you have to get creative on how you supplement these fats on the farm. But at the end of the day, there's probably a lot of opportunity for improving energy corrected milk on our dairies that we've left on the table as the whole industry moved anti-fat in the 2000s and has now come back. There's opportunity to improve incomes for our farm or our dairy producers by feeding more fat.
I'd agree. And I think, as I said, we've been talking about amino acids ever since I've been over here in the US. Now we're really just kind of scratching the surface on the fatty acid side now, but there's a a lot of opportunities to try and learn more on the fatty acid side and the amino acid side, and how do we balance those nutrients to maximize fat and protein. As fat and protein are coming back more on par now, to what it was more historically, we need to be looking at both of those as well. But I think we've learned a lot, but there's a lot of opportunities in the future as well, and that's where these type of discussions help stimulate ideas across the whole playing field here, I think, and for all of us as well. So appreciate the discussion.
No, definitely agree. And gentlemen, I want to thank you both for joining us here at the Exchange tonight. I've loved the insights. I've loved the engaging conversation. And Adam, just, you're becoming a fixture here. Do you anticipate you'll be here next week with us?
Well, yeah, I enjoy doing these, so happy to come back whenever. Especially if there's a gin and tonic involved here, right? So.
Yeah, the bar's always open here at the Exchange. Well, folks, we sincerely appreciate you stopping by to spend some time with us once again here at the Exchange. If you like what you heard, please remember to drop us a 5-star on your way out and subscribe to the alerts so that you'll get alerts to future podcasts. We hope to see you next time here at the Real Science Exchange, where it's always happy hour. The conversation is sometimes saucy, and you're always among friends.